Hello there, and welcome to Frontlines of Social Good. This is Jay Frost speaking to you. I'm very happy to welcome you back. Of course, we'll be giving you all the latest news on the world of social impact and having conversations with two terrific guests who I'll be introducing to you in a moment. But at first, I want to start with some of the stories that are making the news today. Some you may have read about, others may be new to you. So we'll be taking a look at both giving around the United States, as well as some of the major news coming out of Washington. First, we start with lawmaker efforts to abolish USAID. This is something you may have heard about recently in the news. The latest comes just in the last 24 hours when, according to, for example, Clayton News Daily, Republican Representatives Gregory Stube and I think it's Stubbe, actually, of Florida, and Marjorie Taylor Greene of Georgia have introduced legislation to eliminate USAID, or the Agency for International Development. Their bills would halt all federal funding to the agency, transferring key functions to the State Department. This move allows President Donald Trump's mandate suspending USAID operations and appointing the Secretary of State Marco Rubio as acting administrator. Greene, who leads the Department of Government Efficiencies, or DOGE's War on Waste initiative, called USAID, quote, a $40 billion slush fund. In other news, Luka Doncic has donated $500,000, the latest gift to be reported in LA wildfire relief. An NBA star is making an impact off the court as he transitions to his new team and has decided to donate a $500,000 donation through his foundation to support wildlife recovery efforts in the city. He's emphasized the importance of rebuilding homes, schools, and play spaces for children affected by the devastation and promised to help not only with immediate recovery, but also with long-term restoration efforts, stating, quote, every kid needs a safe place to play. We also found in the last week the passing of the Aga Khan, a name that's probably familiar to all of us in the world of philanthropy. Aga Khan is has been the spiritual leader of approximately 12 million Ismaili Muslims worldwide. He died at the age of 88. The Guardian reports that he became the 49th Imam in 1957, succeeding his grandfather. Known for his significant philanthropy, he established numerous healthcare and educational initiatives through the Aga Khan Development Network. His son has been named as his successor, becoming the 50th Imam. Back to Washington once again, where changes at the Kennedy Center are making a lot of news and also posing some confusion. In a controversial move, just recently, President Trump has appointed Rick Grinnell, his longtime foreign policy advisor, as the interim executive director of the Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts, a position which did not, under that title, exist prior. The Guardian reports that this decision involved the dismissal of multiple board trustees and has raised concerns about potential politicization and censorship in the arts. President Trump has criticized the prior board for supporting, quote, drag shows targeting youth, and has declared himself chairman of the board. According to the founding legislation, there is some confusion and perhaps controversy about whether or not the board chair may be appointed by the president or if it needs to be appointed by the board itself. In the courts, there are two decisions that have come off in just the last 48 or 72 hours that are material to the nonprofit sector. First, in a legal challenge to the Trump administration, USA Today has reported that a federal judge has temporarily halted sharp cuts to research funding that were set to take effect. The cuts, aimed at reducing the reimbursement rate for university research costs, were challenged by 22 state attorney generals, who argued that they would lead to layoffs and research disruptions, in some places totaling in the tens or hundreds of millions of dollars to educational institutions. There's also been a legal challenge to the federal funding freeze. A federal judge has ordered the Trump administration to immediately restore federal funds that were previously frozen. Judge John J. McConnell Jr. of Rhode Island stated that the administration has defied his earlier order to unfreeze billions in federal funding. Nearly 24 states filed a lawsuit against the freeze, arguing that the government has not complied with the temporary restraining order issued in January. The judge's ruling mandates that the government end any pause in federal funding until a permanent injunction is decided. Already signals from the White House, or at least in the vice president's office, indicate that they may, in fact, challenge these judicial decisions. We have some major philanthropic contributions that have occurred around the country in just the last week. Goldman Fund has awarded $14.3 million, or at least announced it during the last week, $14.3 million in grants awarded to support voter engagement, gun violence prevention, civic education, and climate change mitigation. Knight Foundation has invested $2 million to Plug and Play, an initiative connecting startups, corporations, and investors to foster AI innovation. Templeton Foundation bridges health and faith. That's a new program funded, of course, by the Templeton Foundation of $3.2 million in order to create a bridge between the health and faith communities. And the Isons, that's Amy and David Ison, have donated $1 million to Keeping the Promise, a campaign for Boca Raton Regional Hospital. Now, in our top story today, the Biden administration's policies on nonprofit funding are facing a very sharp reversal, as the White House under President Trump has issued a new directive to federal agencies instructing them to review all government grants and contracts with nonprofit organizations. According to the National Low Income Housing Coalition, the memorandum directs agency and department heads to assess the financial relationships between the government and nonprofits, potentially leading to funding cuts or terminations. As reported by Reuters, White House officials argue that the measure is aimed at ensuring accountability and preventing federal dollars from going to organizations they claim to be involved in activities counter to U.S. interests. The memorandum has sparked widespread concern among nonprofit leaders, many of whom rely heavily on government funding to provide essential services. The National Council on Nonprofits has already issued another statement opposing the measure, warning it could disrupt critical social programs and weaken communities that depend on nonprofit services. Now, to talk more about this, we have a friend of the sector and a person who knows probably more about nonprofits than just about anybody else. And that's, of course, Paul Clolery, editor-in-chief of the Nonprofit Times. Paul's been following issues like this one closely for years, and following this one itself, I know, over the past 24 hours very closely. Paul, thank you very much for being here today and for sharing a little bit about your insights and perspectives on what's occurring today.
Hi, Jay. For some reason, the video is not coming up.
Oh, I see. Well, we'll work with your voice until we can get that video back up for you. But maybe you can share a little bit about your understanding. And there you are. You reappeared. About this initiative. From your perspective, do you think this is a genuine attempt at oversight?
You know, I'm sure you've heard the phrase before, we're from the government and we're here to help you. And everybody then laughs and says, oh my God, that's just a joke, and says the government doesn't help you. Well, we're finding out very soon and very quickly that yes, the government is there to help you, especially when funding is cut with no notice. People will die. People are going to die in many parts of the world. We won't have fresh water in many parts of the world. People are being laid off. It's going to click up the unemployment rate here in the United States and around the world. So yeah, there's big trouble because of this. And I doubt it has anything to do with oversight, since the current administration has said that they're going to try to give the the Secretary of the Treasury, the ability to pull the licenses of nonprofits if they don't see that it's working with the administration. So that there are a lot of problems out there right now.
Could you talk a little bit more about that pulling of licenses? It sounds more like a broadcasting issue than it does a nonprofit issue, but it's not.
No, it isn't. The Trump administration said, as they were coming on board and selecting their secretaries of various departments, that the Secretary of Treasury, the intention was for the Secretary of Treasury to have the authority to investigate a nonprofit and, without warning, cease their 501c3 status. So that is a problem, particularly if you're going to be using it as a political wedge.
These presidential orders, memoranda, actions, they're coming out fast and furiously. And some of them are also being mirrored by actions in Congress, as we reported on just a few minutes ago. The one you just described sounds a lot like the effort before the House in the late fall. I think it was called HR 9495.
Right.
Is that what's coming back once again?
To some extent, yes. To some extent, no. That what's being pushed now by executive fiat is more draconian than, believe it or not, than even that bill that died before getting voted on. there are so many challenges right now to the nonprofit sector, just being able to feed people here in the United States and abroad, and to deal with Head Start programs, to deal with really basic programs within social services across the United States. That this is going to be a real challenge. And the question becomes, when somebody is so deeply embedded in the Justice Department and not having a separate Justice Department, who's going to enforce the law and who's going to enforce what the judges order? It's going to be an interesting constitutional question that the nonprofits, I think, need to really start ratcheting up and working toward some sort of pressure campaign on the current administration to knock it off.
Well, I know that there have been efforts to pull people together. I think the National Council on Nonprofits, they had a webinar on Friday that drew 10,000 participants. So there's some awareness, but there are 1.5 million nonprofits in the country. How much awareness do you think there is of these issues right now?
Oh, I think right now, if you're a nonprofit executive and you're not familiar with the issues that are going on right now, you shouldn't be in the job. This is a national crisis, and I've been calling on. I wrote a piece, I guess about 11 or 12 days ago when this first started, calling on the national networks, the YMCA, the United Way, American Red Cross, everybody, every nonprofit that's got a chapter in just about every hamlet in this country. They need to ratchet up the pressure on their local representatives. We can't have the representative from the Georgia 14th talking about the $40 billion slush fund when almost $1 billion of food is sitting rotting in ports because the money has stopped and it can't be distributed to the people who are hungry and dying. Especially since it's not 40 billion, it's 50 billion. So it's probably important that they know what exactly they're looking at. But
it's pretty sobering, and it begs the question: how aware are people within the administration and Congress of the impact on this kind of granular level, like the food at the ports? And I know that you and your team have been doing some work to try and figure out every element of this. Have you been able to determine whether or not there's an awareness of the impact of these actions?
I'm sure that there's an awareness of the impact of some of the actions. The question is whether people who are aware of it care. I mean, I think that when you have a representative from Tennessee on TV saying, "Oh, it's the USAID is just a Marxist organization and should be torn apart," doesn't understand that food is not a weapon. Food is something that is a defense mechanism. Around the world, America has its footing through the charitable sector, feeding people, goodwill, being on the ground and knowing what's going on the ground. It's a homeland security issue, not just a feeding and social service issue. I don't think many of the Congress people who have been incredibly quiet about this understand the impact of homeland security issues and just the social service needs here in the United States that these measures are taking. Even if you stop it for one day, if you're in a business, they claim to be businessmen, right? If you're in a business, you don't just stop something. You give 24 hours notice, you give 48 hours notice, you give a month's notice that something's going to happen, that funding's going to stop. If you give no notice and just stop somebody's ability to deliver food to somebody and clean water to somebody and to feed kids in Head Start programs, that's just cruel.
Well, I know the scope of the dollars is broad. Maybe we can start with the scope of services that are impacted by this. What types of nonprofits do you think are the most vulnerable if federal funding is not just delayed, which is already serious, but also cut potentially?
Well, it depends. Right now, we're seeing, since everything's frozen right now, and being able to not draw down on the revenue, children's programs are going to get hurt. Head Start's going to get hurt. Feeding programs are going to get hurt. Education, after schools programs are going to be damaged because of the lockdown or the intention of a lockdown on the Department of Education. So just about every nonprofit is going to be impacted by this. And The government has contracted for years and years and years. It was really ratcheted up under the Reagan administration, where the government outsourced various programs to the charitable sector so that they could reduce the number of people in the federal government and actually deliver the services better. There was a recognition that the charitable sector could deliver the services better than the federal government could. And now that has gone on for decades. And now, while there's no doubt that there can be some reform within the federal government and the budget, there's no doubt that nonprofits can do a little bit better with regard to how they're spending money. And everything should always be audited. Everything should always be looked at. And nonprofits are always audited. I mean, that's the whole point of going into the Form 990 and providing it to the IRS. But when you cut the IRS and nobody is able to actually look at the Form 990s and most tax forms, the audit function by the federal government is very, very small. So the federal government has the ability to come in and audit the nonprofit sector, and it should be welcomed. But when you shut down somebody's ability to eat with no notice, that's just cruel.
Let's talk about the dollars. I know that the Urban Institute released a study just recently that's talking about the current status of where nonprofits are in relation to government funding. I think they said it's about 20% or 25% rely on it for more than half the revenue. Do you have a sense about those numbers? First of all, does that read right to you? And if so, whether or not it does the reliance on these federal dollars, especially after all this time since the Reagan administration today has passed, shouldn't that be a warning to nonprofits that they need to diversify their revenue streams in order to provide these services?
Well, it depends on how you're doing the math. For example, if you're an international relief organization, most of the money is going to come from the government because you're feeding people through USDA and other federal programs. So yes, there are organizations that will have half of their budget because that is what the mandate is from the government. The government said, can you do this? Here's the contract, here's the cash, can you go do this? Mm-hmm. And nonprofits have stepped up and went and fed people, provided water. I mean, there are people talking on television about the $15 million that for condoms in Africa. Well, that's not the story. The story is the $15 million was for an overall HIV program. Yes, condoms were part of it, but it was to deliver HIV medication and preventive sources to people. And if you stop people's HIV medicines with no notice, they will die. So this is just another example of, is the cutback a problem? Maybe, maybe not. Doing it suddenly and with no notice, that is in fact what's going to end up killing people.
And now we're at this moment where organizations have to make these decisions, and one of them is another budgetary decision about it's often called the internal cost recovery rate, or some kind of overhead, people might think of it as, but it's just the administrative cost of doing business.
Right.
And nonprofits have a cost, as all businesses have a cost. And there's some effort, I believe, now being discussed in Washington from the administration about reducing that overhead rate or that internal cost recovery rate. Have you heard any more about that? And what do you think the implications are of that?
The implications of that have long been discussed. This is nothing new. I mean, the Better Business Bureau has long had overhead suggested rates of 35% or less. And it also depends on how you're doing the math. If Jay Frost is in charge of feeding kids, is he overhead or is he program? So that becomes the question. How are you deciding whether something is overhead or something is program? And obviously there have been lots of stories and lots of discussion about over the decades that I've been doing this about overhead. And again, there's no doubt that overhead should be watched, but how you're doing the math, if you don't have an individual working and doing the deliveries, an individual working and providing the food, you don't have a program. So is it a program cost or is it an overhead cost?
So again, you have been covering this a long time and talking with people about it. How how are the articles, the coverage, including the editorials, for example, in the Nonprofit Times, trying to help contextualize this for people, even though we don't really know what's going to happen tomorrow or what will be the outcome of any of these court cases or how the administration might respond to those court cases. What kinds of advice or counsel are being provided, not only by the Times, but by others, so that organizations can manage to navigate this very unforeseeable environment?
Well, one thing that I think everybody should be thinking about is the reserves. I mean, everybody has been talking about nonprofit reserves, and if they've got 30 days, 90 days, should they have 6 months? Should they have a year of reserves? And this is where capital reserves and really come into play. If you've got only 30 days of reserve and this mandate is down for 30 days, you're in trouble. You're out of business. So there are going to be a lot of nonprofits that don't have the cushion that they need, and they will be in serious trouble. But there are others that, of course, out there that have had the cushion and have the 6-month cushion in the bank that they can wait this out probably. I think that there's a lot of philanthropy out there that's sitting on the sidelines. I think that foundations, I think donor advised funds, people with donor advised funds, endowments really need to step up. They say, "Oh, we're saving our money for a rainy day." Look out the window; it's raining. So it's time for the foundations, and it's time for the endowments and others to step up, because this is a crisis.
One of the elements of these discussions is about endowments themselves and potentially trying to tax endowments at colleges and universities. Do you have any sense about how far along that discussion has gone, and where does that fit into your discussion about having that money for a rainy day, if the rainy day funds themselves may be taxed, or an effort may be made to tax them?
Well, I think that there's long been a challenge with some university endowments with regard to how they're handling their money. I did a piece years ago about how Harvard University had enough in the endowment to not have to charge a student a dime for 50 years, and still would have money in reserve. So I've long said that there should be an issue or discussion anyway with regard to hoarding in some school colleges and universities. But I mean, when a college has an investment in a wine farm out in California, when you're on the East Coast, is that really good use of endowment money? So there's always been a discussion about how educational organizations handle their endowments, but there are a lot of community foundations that really need to get involved more. The heart and soul of a community. I mean, I live in a small town. We've got a community foundation. Yeah, so every town, or most towns, a lot of towns will have a community foundation. They really need to ratchet up and start getting the message out to the people within who have donor advised funds within those community foundations to get up and start getting the money out the door. I mean, there's always been an argument for the last whatever that donor advised funds are not getting out the money as fast as they should. Dollar in, dollar out. Yes, they've got a percentage that they've got to give out every year, but when you see foundations not paying out at the 5% level truly, but by taking money out of their endowments and giving it into a donor advised fund, so the 5% looks like it's being done, that's not the way it's supposed to work. So we'll see what happens as donor advised funds get more of a spotlight on them.
When you have covered stories like these and so many others over the years, I get a sense that bringing sunlight to these issues does usually help.
Absolutely.
Is it helping? Is it making a difference today? And if so, where? I mean, if federal, state, local. I'm obviously an advocate for journalism. What I'm wondering here is what kind of impact it's having, and how can we ensure that the best information gets to the people who are making these decisions that are affecting so many of us?
I think that a lot of the people who are reading this, the executives in the nonprofit space, have to also look at their sources of information. If if it doesn't smell right, do some more work. Go look at your own organization. Go look at other organizations and see if it's working. I mean, there have been a lot of accusations of fraud that is simply not true. So it's a challenge that that the charitable sector has to make sure that the truth gets out, and you got to be transparent. If a donor comes in and says, "Well, what about the money that I gave you for program X?" Be ready to provide that information. Don't obfuscate. Don't delay. Open the doors. Come on in. That's been the heart and soul of the nonprofit sector. It's the heart of the community. You are the part of the community that helps the heart beat. You are the place where people go when they need help. Be as transparent as possible. Open the books, open your doors, and get your donors also to understand that this is one of the most delicate times that I've seen in the 30 years or so that I've been doing this.
And just to follow up on that, one conversation I heard in the last couple of weeks has been about organizations deciding to scrub their websites and other materials of references, for example, to DEI, out of concern that it might put them at odds with any kind of grant maker, especially obviously the federal government. That's one approach to this. I'm just wondering about your reaction to that. That reaction out of fear or concern that goes towards self-protection. How well does that serve the nonprofit sector?
Well, if you're an organization that is within that community, how do you scrub your website? You can't. But also, for every job opportunity that's out there, people have always said for decades, equal opportunity employer. Isn't that the same thing as DEI? That's just my view of things. So if you're an equal opportunity employer, you believe in DEI. Just my view from the bridge before I jump off it.
Well, so maybe just kind of to close out some of this discussion, because it's a moving target. I can imagine
Absolutely.
Every day we could talk with you and we could get consistent answers, but about different things.
I got to tell you though, in the last week or so, I can't tell you how many CEOs, not just at nonprofits, but at vendors to nonprofits, that I've had to talk off the ledge, reminding people that it's only 18 months before the midterms.
So can they make it the 18 months?
Through litigation and negotiation and a Congress that might be pressured to start rethinking how they look at certain programs. Yes, I think that the sector can survive 18 months. It'll be very different. It'll be a challenge. It's going to be 3 times or 4 times or 5 times worse than COVID, but the sector will get there. The sector will survive. It'll survive in almost anything.
Thank you so much for all this, Paul. Really, really appreciate it. I know that you told me before we went live that your team has done what in the last 11 hours working on one story. Can you tell us what we can look for next?
Oh no, what that you misunderstood. We had the stories had been up like for 11 hours.
Oh, I see. Well, what's coming in next in terms of your coverage on these issues?
Oh, we're just going to ignore it for a while now and just not doing it. No, we're in touch with everybody, and when something comes up, we'll be breaking it first. We always do a breaking news item up on the website as soon as something happens, and we back it up a couple hours later with some industry knowledge and some people who can break it down for us. But this is the time when there is no time to wait for what other people think. This is time to get the information out. This is what happened, and you need to start thinking for yourself how you're going to help your organization. We'll bring you perspective. We'll bring you other voices. It'll be a couple of hours, but we'll bring you those other voices. But right now, a judge just said this, or the administration just did that, and so you've got to be able to turn on your heels and react to your particular organization. Again, thank you, Paul. The Nonprofit Times, if you're not getting it in digital and hopefully print edition form, then I hope you will. When he says that there's breaking news, it's not hyperbole at the Nonprofit Times, it's the real deal.
Thank you so much, Paul. Really appreciate
Always
it.
happy, always happy to talk to you, Jay.
Now we're going to move on and talk about something with kind of a different flavor, but with a person who's just lived through a real live actual emergency. In fact, we touched on it a few minutes ago when in addressing the news. Of course, one of the things that's been quite topical for us is the effects of wildfires. If it wasn't just in LA, of course, it was a year before that and everything that happened in Maui. But this is not something that just happens once. It happens place after place. And the person that we have that we're going to bring on board with you now is the author of a book that probably gives us perspective. So no matter what may be facing us, we'll be able to deal with it with a big heart and thinking about not just ourselves but others, and being able to move past the temporary to something a little bit more permanent. And that is Heidi Johnson, the author of Change for Good, the transformative power of giving as the ultimate cure. Heidi, thank you so much for hanging out here today with me.
Thank you for having me, Jay. It's great to be here. And I have to just tag along to what Paul said. And your last question is, will the sector survive? And I have to say that people helping people is who we are, and that will never end. That will never stop, and people will always help one another. And so I just felt like that needed to be said, because I think people feel helpless sometimes. And I think when you think about how good people are, you realize that that's not anything that's going away anytime soon.
That's kind of the heart of what you're writing about here in this book too, and everything you do on your podcast, etc. You've spent years working in the nonprofit sector. You have, of course, Charity Matters, and then you write this book. But for those who don't know your work and haven't heard the interview we conducted with you for the podcast yet, can you just give people a little window on what inspired this book?
Sure. So I have been in the nonprofit space for 22 years, starting a nonprofit in 2003. And then after starting that nonprofit, I thought, who are these people? These are the hardest working people. This job is so hard. And who runs a business that relies on the kindness of others, which is an innately very flawed, difficult business model, as we all know. And at the time, there wasn't People Magazine Heroes Among Us or CNN Heroes. So I went out in search of finding other nonprofit founders and really wanting to hear their story. And have been interviewing them with Charity Matters, the blog, and now the podcast for, I don't know, a very long time, over 12, 13 years, something like that, 14 years. I lose track of the years, but hundreds and hundreds of nonprofit founders I've interviewed. And they are the most inspirational, selfless, amazing, remarkable humans who put service above everything. And when I was approached by my publisher, I kind of had little pieces of the quilt. I had collected so many stories, and I had an opportunity to put them all together, and really the life lessons that I've learned from these amazing people. And so the theme of the book is really that service is the silver bullet. There is no silver bullet, but if there was one, helping another person is ultimately the cure to having a joyful, purposeful, happy life.
I'm imagining doing all these interviews, as you've done hundreds of them, as you said, that's a lot of pieces of fabric to make a quilt. So how could you choose what to pull in and what to, leave to the side?
It is. And people all say, oh, who's your favorite nonprofit? What's your favorite? I'm sure you get the same question. How do you choose when I have 1.6 million organizations that all do remarkable good for our world. There is no choosing a favorite. But what I really did is I looked kind of at the pieces, the steps of going from loss to rebirth, which is really the evolution of a lot of nonprofits. 95% of the people I've interviewed, including myself, we've had a loss and a tragedy. And out of that, we didn't want that to happen to the next person. And so we created an organization to pay it forward. And maybe 5% of the people I've interviewed have had a near miss and incredible gratitude, and they've started the organization out of gratitude. And so kind of tracking the journey of these people and from the loss to the rebirth, to finding purpose, to finding joy and gratitude and obstacles and all those things, putting all of those in the stories in kind of collective piles or chapters, as they ended up being, is really how I ended up putting the book together, and really the journey that we should all go through. All of us, most of us, I should say, do not get out of this lifetime without being handed a bad card or two. And we have a choice how we play it. And so I'm kind of laying out the path that many of these nonprofit founders and I have gone on to find joy and purpose in helping other people.
It strikes me that as you talk about this, these stories are very personal for people, even if they're able to turn their pain into purpose.
Right.
It may be difficult to say, well, this happened to me. I don't know if you found that. Is everybody that you've interviewed throughout this whole process through these years very willing to go to that pain place because they've overcome it in order to help others? So are they willing to revisit?
It's yes and no. And I think it's a great question. The one thing I will say that every nonprofit founder wants to talk about is their work. And the last thing they want to talk about is themselves. And they don't want to tell the founder story. But the founder story is the foundation of your organization. It is the story that all the other stories are built upon. And it doesn't have to be the story in the front. It doesn't have to be the most recent story. But most founders have had to tell their story so many times just to get their volunteers and their initial grassroots together to get going. And so there comes a point where you tell your story a lot. And sometimes I find myself telling my story and thinking, gosh, I hope I wasn't non-emotional about that, because you tell it so often. But a lot of nonprofit founders just would rather tell another story and rather than their own. So getting them on the podcast, once they tell their story, they're remarkable. But I encourage nonprofit founders to keep their story out in front, to have their story on their website, to make sure their story is there so people understand how this organization began and the goodness that came from their loss or their story.
What is the effect on those who read those stories or the people who have heard yours? Do you sense that motivates them or somehow liberates them to be more involved?
100%. It connects the dots. It connects the dots. I'm speaking at a national charity league tomorrow night, and I said, "Well, what causes are you working with?" And they said, "Oh, we're working with Operation Gratitude." I said, "Oh, do you know Carolyn Blashak? She's amazing. She's one of the first women I interviewed. I mean, so long ago." And this organization that has hundreds and hundreds of women and volunteers and young ladies they're trying to teach service to said, "No, who's that?" I said, "Well, Operation Gratitude has done over 2 million care packages for military around the world. Carolyn's the founder." And Carolyn's story is on their website, and Carolyn has been on 60 Minutes, and Carolyn is amazing. But what's interesting, so I said to this woman I was speaking to, I said, "Well, this is her story." She said, "That's the most remarkable story. I didn't even know we're doing all this work. I didn't even know that story." I said, "Her story's incredible." And so it reignites their passion and their excitement. They already loved Operation Gratitude, but now they're like, "Wow, that's an amazing story." And anyone who doesn't know Carolyn's story should go to Operation Gratitude's website and definitely look it up, or Google her on 60 Minutes, because she's an amazing human being.
Well, I realized because of the context of talking with you about your book, I didn't give you an opportunity to give a little bit of information about your own story. Is that something you're willing to share here as well?
Sure, of course, of course. As I said, we tell our stories, and they're part of who we are, and we should. Some of there's pain in some stories, and there's joy in other stories, but they all are layers of our life, and they're all important because they all get us to where we are. My story really began, and starting the nonprofit and everything began in 2002, November 9th, 2002. I received that phone call in the middle of the night that everyone tells you not to answer. And it was a phone call telling me there'd been a horrible accident. My parents were on vacation in Mexico with their four best couple friends, four couples, everybody celebrating 60th birthdays, having the time of their life. And they were leaving lunch and going to the perfect beach, and they were so happy. And in a second, they were hit by a bus, hit by a huge tour bus. And in an instant, three were dead. One was brain dead. Every couple lost a spouse. My mother was instantly killed. My father was in a coma. And it turned my life upside down. It was that just shock. And um, life changed in the blink of an eye. Just in a blink, everything changed. But a year later, and just to even go back, my father went home from the hospital from his coma Thanksgiving Day that year, and faith really pulled us through. Our family has deep faith, and it pulled us through. And a year later, I was given an opportunity through a whole long story, which I won't go into all the details because of time, but to help a children's hospital. There was only one chaplain, and the chaplain asked me to bring friends and to come down and to help. And the result is we ended up starting a nonprofit called Spiritual Care Guild to provide chaplains of all faiths at Children's Hospital Los Angeles. And so 10 of us created this grassroots organization, and we changed the culture of a 100-year-old institution, have a $10 million interfaith center, have a national template for pediatric chaplaincy. Our chaplains do medical rounds. And this beautiful gift of service healed me in unimaginable ways from my loss and brought purpose and joy, and so many things have come in this book and this conversation we're having from that loss.
Yeah. And tying it back to the thing we started at the top of the hour with, that Templeton Foundation gift that's trying to bridge faith and health. This is something where it's been an issue for a long time. And so one of the things, the most remarkable things about your story is that you were bringing something in, I think maybe many people thought was already there, but it wasn't. That chaplaincy.
Wasn't there. No, it wasn't there. And really, it does, giving people hope and faith heals them. And it's not taking them in a vulnerable time and preaching. It is not pushing religion. That is not at all what we do. Chaplains are there to listen. Preachers tell you to listen. A chaplain listens to you and what it is that you need. And they hear you and your pain in that moment, or your fear, or what you're concerned about, or for your child or yourself or your loved one. And there's a big difference.
One of the reasons I touched on that is because there is support for faith-based initiatives, all faiths, interfaith especially, and much of that funding or support in some form has also come from the government, state and local and federal. Are you starting to hear anything about concerns among the organizations that you know, because you talk with so many, about the current environment for support for organizations generally, but especially for faith-based organizations who are carrying out this work?
You know, I know it's a trickle-down effect. It's starting, and it's going to start from the big guys. And I usually talk to the medium to small guys because I love to tell the entrepreneurial journey of a nonprofit founder. And, you know, the mom and pop hardware store that is not quite Home Depot. And it doesn't mean that the Red Cross and all of these huge organizations are not doing fabulous work. You know, I've talked to Project Hope, and I've talked to some of the bigger guys in the past, and I love talking to them as well, because that's who everybody wants to be, because the more people we help, the better we feel, right? But I have not talked to anyone in the last couple of weeks as all this has been unfolding. But I do think it's going to trickle down. In LA, you know, with wildfires and government funding and homelessness, I think just living where I live, that's more kind of the things that we're hearing about and people are concerned about right now. So that's kind of where we're at.
The reason I ask in part is because small and medium-sized organizations, whether they're feeling a direct impact of a government grant being available or not, and this happens with every administration, it's just on a larger scale right now, is that organizations have to find a way of translating their stories into that change, as you're talking about in
Right.
the book, and a personal journey here, but also an organizational journey for many and for the organization that you founded in the past. And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on how organizations can, irrespective of whether or not they rely on some form of governmental support, they can double down on their interactions with their neighbors to allow them to come in and support their work, sure, as volunteers, but also as donors.
Right. You know, I think that what I loved hearing Paul say, and what I think we're seeing just in culturally, is a shift to back to community. And I think we're seeing, and not that it isn't great to take care of the world, but we have to know our next door neighbor, and we have to know our school, and we have to know our church, whatever that is. And getting back to, it doesn't mean we can't take care of, when we have enough to take care of our community, that we can't give to other communities. That is not at all what I'm saying. But really, I'm seeing a lot of people getting back to the basics of community. And I do think that that is really important, because when our communities are strong, then everything else gets stronger. Everything gets better when our local communities are strong. There is an upward spiral, and there is a positive effect. That's when we can start giving nationally and giving globally. But we have to really start with our communities.
I do want to ask you about that from another lens, which is that community activation that you're talking about right now. You talked about the casserole brigade when we talked last time,
Yes.
and you don't have to retell the whole story
No.
unless you want to, but I found it really tangible and moving, in that you just lived through a fire. Fortunately, your home was safe, and I think your neighborhood
Yes.
was, but it was
Yes.
just by a fingernail. And many
Yes.
of your neighbors were not so lucky. You're in the LA area.
Yes.
I raise this because, as you said in that interview, that when something happens, and we know our neighbors, we don't all have the benefit of that, but when we do, often they'll just run in and help, and they'll bring the
Right.
casserole. But after a
Right.
certain amount of time, those casseroles stop coming. It's not because people don't care. Maybe it's because of something else. So I'm wondering if you
Right.
can share a little bit about that, about how we can sustain that power of purpose in our lives, as well as in our organization's work, so that we can make sure that those casseroles keep coming, or at least that the
Right.
instinct to keep checking on our neighbors remains.
And Jay, I mean, it is the $1,000,000 question, how we keep our focus on something in a world where there's a bright, shiny object and a new headline and a new something to take our attention at every possible second of the day. But we did talk about this, and I used the analogy when my mother died. You know, my father, you know, for weeks and weeks and months after he, was very sick, and he came out of his coma. He's like, "Oh, the casserole brigade is here." They would just line up, and it was wonderful for weeks, probably 6 weeks, 7 weeks. But people were bringing food. It was amazing. But then all of a sudden, the crickets show up, and they're gone, and people have moved on. And there's another death. There's another something happening, and they've moved on. And I'm running a GoFundMe for a friend who lost everything. I have 13 friends that have lost everything. I'm running one of my dear friends' GoFundMe's, and I live near the Rose Bowl in Pasadena, and 2 weeks ago, when I walk up to my view and I look down at the Rose Bowl, every inch of our soccer field and everything was National Guard tents, hundreds and hundreds of National Guard tents, and hundreds of fire trucks as far as you could see, and people feeding them, and people bringing them, excuse me, toiletries, and bringing them everything they could possibly, snacks and water and everything. It was a beehive of activity. And I walked out yesterday, and it was an empty soccer field. There was not a person around. And I thought about the casserole brigade. And I went online with my GoFundMe, and I sent a picture of the empty field, and I said, everyone may have left, the news headlines may have changed, but our love for our community endures. And it doesn't matter if people are here or not, our love is still here. And I put the link for my GoFundMe, that we are, trying to raise money for my dear friend's Stephanie and Dave Edens. And it was really, it made me, it was disheartening because everything I told you, I looked at it, the empty field to me was exactly what I talked about. And it just broke my heart. And yet the people here, we were still volunteering at the Elks Club last weekend and giving out new robes and sheets and towels and everything. But yeah, it happens. It happens. And I think the only way is to just keep remembering the people that you love, the people you care about in your community, and that they need you. And if someone dies, they need you 4 months later. They don't need you in the casserole brigade. If someone loses everything, they need you 5 months later. And to remind yourself to put a post-it note. And if your cause or something you care about, you donated at Christmas because it was so important, they need you 5 months later. The need did not go away just because it isn't the season of giving or because it isn't the time. The need is always there. It's just, where is your heart and where is your attention?
On a personal level, you talk about transformative power of giving as opposed to just traditional charitable giving. What is the
Right.
difference in your mind, if any, and how can people practice that both individually and then through the organizations that they know and trust, like the ones, whether it's a GoFundMe account that they've set up, or whether it's the
Right.
church or the synagogue or the mosque or an organization like, United Way or something? How can they practice the transformational power of this thing instead of the transactional one?
I think it starts with a transactional, right? We have to get in the habit of giving first, and it just becomes something that you do. But you may not feel the joy from it. It may just be something that you were taught to volunteer. You were taught to give, a couple extra bucks here and there. You were taught to put $5 in the collection at church. And that's okay. And there's no judgment on any of it, by the way. I don't care if you're a homeless person giving half your cracker to your neighbor, or you're a billionaire donating a building. It's not my place to judge what you give or how you give or who you give. That is not at all the purpose of any of this. The purpose of it is for you to have joy in doing it and purpose in doing it. And so when you start to give and you start finding what your gifts are, what you're good at, what you love, where your passion aligns with giving, where that intersection comes of what you love and a cause that relates to that. And you start connecting with that, and it starts fueling the gifts that you have and the gifts that you're able to give away, whether it's time or financial, either way. That's when it starts to magnify. That's when you start feeling a purpose and a connection. That's when you start getting something back from what you're doing because it aligns with who you are and what you're supposed to be doing. And that's when the upward cycle continues. And when it starts going upward, then what do? You start recruiting more people to give. And that's when we start magnifying our efforts. And it isn't just from our dollars, but it's from telling our friends and our neighbors, this is the greatest cause. Come join me. Come down and do this with me. This is so fantastic. You will love the people that you meet here. You will make new friends. You will do. And that's when the joy happens and the gratitude and the purpose. And that's what I'm talking about. And that's what I want everyone to feel. I want everyone to think about the Harry Met Sally commercial that they just redid in the Super Bowl and for mayonnaise, and think about, I want what she's having, because that's people that give. That's how they are. They're that happy. That's truly how happy they are.
Thank you so much, Heidi. Really, really appreciate it. Everybody, once again, Change for Good, Heidi Johnson, get the book. Thank you, Heidi. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Jay. Thanks for having me.
Great to see you. Okay, folks. Well, we do not have a profile of charity today. However, I want to keep the door open to all of you. If there is an organization that you think should be featured, an organization we should visit for an interview on site, or a video that you think speaks to the work that they do and the impact that they have, we want to know. So please contact us directly. My name is Jay Frost. Of course, you can reach me at jay@donorsearch.net, or you can find me on LinkedIn. And you can also, if you're here with us live, write to us in the chat. We look forward to your suggestions, whether it's your organization or one that you know and trust. That's really all for today's edition of Frontlines, but we will have shows coming up in the next few days. I hope you'll tune in for those. Alan Clayton will be here talking about his new book next Tuesday, along with, again, topical stories in the news. we will have an edition of the podcast. We released one on Friday, and another one comes on this Friday. Last Friday was Sharice Harrison, who is the president-elect of APRA. And this Friday, we have coming up Sarah Lumelin, who is, of course, the head of Philanthropy Together. And she tells about her work in building giving circles around the world. It's an interview you do not want to miss. And in the meantime, you can check out her TED Talk. We also, of course, have a session coming up this Thursday with our friend from the series, Amy Eisenstein, ACFRE, who is going to be teaching us all about how to conduct campaigns. And if you're in the middle of trying to figure out how to finance what you want to do in the future, that big vision, do show up for that and collect your CFRE credit as well. Our thanks, of course, to our sponsor, DonorSearch, without whom none of this would be possible. You can check them out at DonorSearch.net. There will probably be a little survey at the end of today's show, so you can fill that out, or you can just write to us and let us know what you think about this and our other shows. And I want to thank you also the people at Insightful for helping us with news stories that we featured at the beginning of today's program. Well, look forward to seeing you next time. Until then, thanks, everyone.